So the next shift we're going to talk about is how to get neuroscience on your side. So first of all, a little bit about the research. So there's some research that shows that stress has been shown to reduce IVF success rates in 36% of couples. And there was a big research study where they took long-term stress. They took a marker of cortisol, long-term cortisol in the body, and they found that it correlated very strongly with the couples who weren't able to fall pregnant with IVF. And that, again, like I said, that shows that IVF, okay, you can treat a lot of things, but the one thing it can't treat is the stress. And for a lot of people, that's the reason they're not falling pregnant. And we're going to talk about the biology behind that in a minute. But second of all, there's research that shows that reducing stress has a direct impact on the proteins in the lining of the uterus that are involved in implantation. Another piece of research from the Journal of Human Reproduction shows that conception is much more likely to occur in those months when couples reported feeling good, happy, and relaxed. So let's talk about some of the biology behind that. So this slide, don't worry about the technical details. Basically what it's showing is the brain at the top there, and you've got the lightning bolts are actually representing chronic stress and the effect that has on the brain. And what that does is it causes the pituitary gland to secrete certain hormones, which then affect the adrenal cortex and the medulla, the yellow blob in the middle there. And that secretes what are called glucocorticoids, such as adrenaline and cortisol. And then those chemicals, those hormones actually act on the brain, and they go back up and they affect the amygdala. And what that does is it then sends a cascade of events back through the pituitary gland throughout the body, and you can see what that leads to is a whole list of things at the bottom: the exacerbation of chronic conditions, hypertension, obesity, diabetes, anxiety, and suppression of reproductive function. So there's been research recently that shows that about 80% of all illnesses these days in the Western world are caused by stress, and this is the mechanism that actually happens through. So the take home from that slide is that chronic stress causes the release of stress hormones such as cortisol. And then cortisol acts on the brain via the pituitary gland, where it disrupts the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. The hormones that get disrupted include the reproductive hormones. So in this slide, we're looking at the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So the pituitary is the little gland, little lobe that hangs down from the bottom of the brain. And the hypothalamus is a control center in the brain, and it actually regulates which hormones get released by the pituitary gland. And in the part on the left, you can see that where it says no stress, there's just a normal release of what's called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of certain what are called peripheral sex hormones. You might know them as follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. In the one on the right there, where there's the stress represented by the lightning strike, what happens is the glucocorticoids that are released by the stress, the cortisol, actually activates the gonadotropin inhibitory hormone, GnIH, and that it becomes activated so that it actually has an inhibitory effect on gonadotropin releasing hormone. So it stops gonadotropin releasing hormone from doing its job, which in turn stops or inhibits the release of the peripheral sex hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So basically just the take home from that slide is that stress inhibits the release of the reproductive hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So why does that happen? Why would your body develop a mechanism that would actually inhibit reproduction when you're stressed? It kind of doesn't make sense. But actually, if you look at evolution, it does make sense. And it comes back to the fight or flight mechanism that you may or may not have heard of. But it's actually a protection mechanism that was designed by evolution. So what happened millions of years ago when we were walking around the savannas, and there was a physical threat, say we were being chased by a dangerous animal, the body adapted and created a mechanism whereby when there was a physical threat, you could actually, the chemicals, the cortisol, triggered a certain cascade of events in the body which caused the blood flow and the energy to be redirected away from certain organs and into the muscles and into the heart, so that you could either run away or stay and fight, hence being called the fight or flight mechanism. And what would happen is the blood flow and the energy gets taken away from the reproductive organs and put into the muscles and the heart. Because at that moment, it's not a good time to have a baby, because the energy needs to go into the muscles to keep you alive, rather than to think about creating new life. And what's happened, that mechanism still exists in the body today, hundreds of thousands of years later, millions of years later. But instead of being triggered by physical threat for most people, it's emotional stress that triggers that same response. Because the body shuts down in order to protect you, because it thinks you're under threat, even though it's not a physical threat. It's the same biological mechanisms. There's also a connection in the body between high levels of adrenaline and low levels of progesterone. And it's the progesterone that actually is responsible for building up the lining of the uterus. And just a little note to say that what we're talking about here is nothing to do with, just stop trying. So the way we're going to look at reducing your stress levels has got nothing to do with just stop trying. Because then, it's like about negating. It's about don't do that. And as we've seen, that doesn't work.